So, ha. Oh, it was more melodious. Okay. Okay, so there were like a lot of breaks that were there. The other one was like almost continuous. Okay, so basically these two birds, they one is found. So this is the Western Ghats, and these are high elevation, these mountain tops, and you find that bird to the north of this Palghat area, the Palghat Gap, and the other birds found to the south of it. And so these birds actually very rarely see each other. And people like us who study birds have the very same questions. So when we watch these birds, and you hear their song, you start wondering, does this actually sound different or is it similar? And if it is, then what is the similarity? What is the difference? And that is actually how I started asking questions about these birds. Okay, so what I'm going to do is try and tell you maybe by the end of the talk how similar or different these birds are and what that actually means in an evolutionary kind of consequence. Okay, so yeah, this is a little bit more like a brightened up image, so you can see the birds actually. The other one was you could not see it. Yeah, I'm not going to play that again. But the whole idea is, I think you've now been exposed to this whole concept of islands and Darwin's finches. We've seen quite a few examples of it. But I think the main point is that what happens with these islands is that there is some kind of isolation between these islands. So if you were to think about it, it's not that they are islands. That's not what is actually causing this, differentiation and speciation or anything. It's that isolation. But you could have that isolation even if the water bodies are isolated by some land, or it could be like forests which are deforested. Something comes in between. But very specifically, I'm kind of interested in these mountain tops, the tops of the mountains that are actually they have a very specific kind of cold and wet kind of an environment. They are isolated from each other by a valley which has a slightly different environment. So if you go from Ooty and you get down to Coimbatore, you kind of feel some of this difference, right? So what we are trying to do is understand how there's time and there is space. So this is space, how mountains are separated from each other, but these separations could happen for different periods of time. Like you can have deforestation which is fairly recent, but at the scale of mountains being isolated from each other is really long back. So you can think about it, this is just a cartoon. Imagine that you have 3 blocks of some habitat, and there is a bird that is kind of trying to move between these habitats. So normally you would think that most people think that birds can fly. So what's the big deal if the habitats are a little bit farther away from each other? They should just be able to fly from one patch to the other. But how far can they fly? So what if the islands are, really far apart? And then, the question comes if, is it, there are different kinds of birds also. There are some really large birds, there are some very small birds. So what kinds of traits, as you may have heard with other speakers before, there are traits of species that relate to whether, in this case, they can cross a barrier or not. So what traits in species allow them to kind of cross these barriers? But while you have a cartoon like this, in reality what you may have is something like this. So you have a whole bunch of fragments and stepping stones between populations and so on. So it can be quite complicated actually. So like I was saying, a lot of the focus of my work has been in the south, and what you see in the brown are these high elevation areas. And what's happened there is that this should all be green, if everything was natural. So all the white that you see is all some kind of deforestation, some kind of change that has happened in that landscape. So a different perspective. So this is the Western Ghats, and here's the Palghat Gap. I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of do one of those fly-throughs. We'll go from the south and go up until these high elevation areas, and I think you can look out for place names here. But this is Agastya Malay is what it's called. This is a Shenkuta Gap. There is a narrow valley and a gap there. You can see the dry, low elevation habitats here. And this is High Wavies, Meghamalaya Wildlife Sanctuary is there. There's a plateau, like a mid-elevation plateau here. Again, the dry habitat here, the wet here. And this kind of goes on to this Munnar, the tea estates, that's Anemudi. And you can see the grassland forest mosaic. And then it kind of plunges into this, this valley, which is about 40 kilometers wide, before rising up into the Nilgiris. And your Ooty would be somewhere there, and that's all Shola. We're not going further there. But here you have this Chalayar Valley, which is a really shallow valley. But to the north of that, there are these mountains which are very small, isolated mountains. So this is really a network of mountains, some small, some large, some isolated by large distances, some by very small, fairly small distances. And so often one of the questions that people get is how did these mountains and how old are these mountains? Because you hear of volcanic activity and mountains being created recently, uplifts and so on. So I just wanted to set the clock at the right place, and I'm going to show you something about plate tectonics. I'm sure everyone's kind of heard about this and seen enough animations, but this is 150 million years back, Pangaea, where all these land masses were together, and then India broke away and drifted and kind of hit the Asian plate, right? So the southern Western Ghats actually formed while the plate was kind of the Indian plate was moving, and it is through a series of uplifts. And Palghat Gap is a kind of a fault, or there's a break there. So you imagine a steel plate, and then if you hit the plate from below, it kind of rises up a little bit. So that's how those southern Western Ghat mountains formed, except that at the Palghat Gap, there's a crack in the plate, so that doesn't get lifted up, right? And the point is that these are very old mountains. The passerines, the modern birds, kind of got to the landscape only about 10 to 15 million years back. Not 10, sorry, 15 and between 15 and 20 million years. So, so the mountains were already in place when these birds got here. Okay, so that's something that's important to note. The other is that the wet and cool habitat that I was talking about. There's a lot of rivers kind of originate in this habitat. This one is again, I think, Eraviculam, which is near Munnar. So I started with doing a survey of these birds all across the Western Ghats to try and find out where this one species, the one that you heard where I played the song, where exactly is it found? And then I found that it's actually restricted to these mountain tops. So that was long back during my PhD. And then later for my postdoc, what I decided to do was actually look at the impact of all of this landscape on all birds. Now let me explain this. This is a cross section of the Western Ghats. And if you remember the fly-through, you went from the south to the north. And this is exactly that. So that's Shenkuta Gap, Palghat Gap, and so on. And we kind of ended somewhere here. But you can see that few important things to note here is that the highest elevations of Western Ghats are in the south, right? So this the y-axis is the elevation. And the other thing to note is that there are 3 deep valleys, right? And what we did was we split up the landscape by these valleys. So we call this block A, B, C, and D. And we want to see how different birds are able to kind of, let's say, move between these landscapes or not able to move between these landscapes. So that was primarily what we want to do. And since I think all of you have had some exposure to reading trees, this is, I think you did something with trees, right, earlier today? Yeah? Okay. So this is just very simple cartoon kind of trees, not real trees in that sense. So very simply, you could have a scenario where all the 4, those sets of mountains are very unique genetically from each other, very like differentiated from each other. Or you could have different combinations until maybe you don't find any difference between them, which maybe means that there's movement of these birds between these mountains. Okay? And what we studied was a set of, basically we sampled all the high elevation birds, so all the birds that are found on this mountaintop. And it's interesting that a lot of the endemics, so do you know the idea of endemic? Any guesses? Do you want to? Yeah, so that's about it. So it's found only in a particular kind of a region or something like that. So all the stars, all the birds with the stars are the endemics. So you don't really need to know the names of these birds, but I think what I'd really like you to notice is that there are different kinds of birds here. Some are really small, like this is a 9-gram little flycatcher, black and orange flycatcher. And then you have the Nilgiri wood pigeon, which looks like the spotted dove, but it's actually several times larger. So you could think of it as different kinds of sizes of birds, different habits. I'm sure many of you recognize this. It's a red-whiskered bulbul, right? So it's a generalist. It's found in lots of places, but several of these birds are found only on the mountaintops. So the question is, so for probably a species like red-whiskered bulbul, which is found everywhere, it's you should not find any impact of these big valleys, and that was really the question that we wanted to kind of find out. Which of these birds are impacted by those valleys and which are not, right? So this is my collaborator Vishnu, and what we did was we went up to all those mountaintops. We put up these nets. They're called mist nets, only because it's very difficult to see. It's very fine net, and the birds get caught in the net like this. Actually, so the way birds get caught in the net is not like how fish gets caught in the fish nets. So this is different because it's almost like if you have a sari or something like that, so you hold it lengthwise and then you fold up one part of the sari, it forms a little pouch. So that's actually how the birds. So the bird just comes, hits the net, and it falls in this pouch. And because of the weight, it kind of closes itself in that net, right? So it's just kind of in that pouch-like thing in there. So that's how the birds get caught. And we take a small drop of blood, and then we release the bird within about 15 minutes or so. Okay, so once we have this, we then Yeah, so we sequenced a bunch of genes from it. I won't go into the details of that, but I'll show you. I'm not going to show you phylogenetic trees. What I'll do is I'll kind of represent this cartoon, the Western Ghats with the three major barriers and the A, B, C, D, if you remember, and where we found no phylogenetic impact. There's a line which is continuous, so which means that they are somewhat connected across these mountains, and 14 species we found that way, but 10 of the species were actually in some ways you could say affected by the valleys. So there's a phylogeographic barrier here at the Palghat Gap, and then there was one at the Shenkuta Gap and a minor one at Chaliyar Valley. So this is interesting in some ways because if you look at the numbers of the birds that are affected by each of these valleys, there seem to be most by Palghat Gap, then by Shenkuta Gap, and then by Chaliyar Valley. Yeah? So any relationship you think that? Yeah, so surely, I mean, at this moment we can only speculate, but that is our speculation as well. We think that it is related to the depth and the width of the valley. And we also have some ideas about how this may work, but to kind of give you a little more information on some other result. So this is a little bit tricky. Basically, we are able to calculate divergence times based on some mutation rate that is there. So let's say two populations have a certain percentage of genetic divergence, and if you know that how much mutation happens in a million years, you can kind of scale back and say so many million years of divergence. Okay, that's very simply put. So here, what we find is that Palghat Gap always had the oldest divergence, followed by the Shenkuta Gap, and then followed by the Chaliyar Valley. Okay, so again, this kind of brings to there seems to be some impact of the width and the depth of the valley. So I'm not going to go into this, but basically, so these are the divergence dates of different species. This is millions of years, and you can see that a lot of the species diverged in this this what is called the Pleistocene. It's about 2.5 or so million years. This not very old. They're fairly recent. While these two are actually a little bit older divergences. Now we also know that this is not our data. This is it just shows fluctuation of climate in historic time, and you can see it goes from 0 to 5 million years. You can see that there's a lot of fluctuation in climate at this time. So our working hypothesis is that some kind of paleoclimatic events are responsible for these divergences. But actually the climate interacts with the landscape, and we speculate that maybe these birds were initially found everywhere all through this. So this is the the cross section of the Western Ghats, and maybe as the climate changed, they went up the mountain, and until they got kind of restricted up there. So you can imagine that for these birds to get connected again, the habitat has to get connected because they are habitat specialists. And if the climate is to move the habitat down, the first one to get connected will be the lowest mountain, the lowest valley. And it will take a lot of magnitude of change for the deepest valley to get kind of connected, right? So if you can imagine the habitat moving up and down, this would happen first, and then later this, and then probably that. And this is why we think that the older divergences are at the Pangaea Gap and the younger ones are at the shallower valleys. So in summary, basically what we think is that the deep and wide valleys like the Pangaea Gap along with the paleoclimate actually have resulted in these divergences, these genetic divergences in this landscape. So the two groups that we found were fairly old. What we find is that they were initially thought to be these birds called short wings, and there are these short wings in the Himalayas. There are about 5 species of short wings in Himalayas, and Western Ghats was thought to be one of the short wing species. It's supposed to be like another short wing in that same genus, but it turns out that it's actually very different. And this we know because we had genetic data from the other species, and we could plug into that once we had data from the Western Ghats species. So this was another group, laughing thrushes. They were thought to be laughing thrushes. Again, it turns out that they are not. And what we also found was that on each of these mountains, there were these different species. So because the divergence between them was fairly old. So this is quite a bit like, if you remember the finch, the Darwin's finches kind of the same. Only thing is that we don't know if this is an adaptive radiation. As of now, we don't think so. At least we don't know enough. But definitely it is some kind of radiation on these mountains. So these mountain tops are like, in some ways, they are like oceanic islands. They are islands where you can see processes, evolutionary processes acting very similarly, resulting in the creation of new species. And this is happening in Western Ghats, right? Yeah, so this is just the genetic data that shows that. That's okay, I'll skip that. Yeah, and this is just, it's a, so Western Ghats are actually quite well explored, but just in 1 year, I made the slide in 2017, so you can see the numbers of species that kind of got, new species that were described from the landscape just in 1 year, so that's quite a lot. So it just goes to show that there's a lot more exploration, lot more work that needs to be done in this landscape. The other part was that I'm going to talk about is this idea of islands within these islands, and this is because of landscape change in the habitat. And we know that there's been landscape change for quite a long time, almost 100 years. In different ways. So like a lot of our South Indian tea comes from this landscape. But that's not it. There's also, if you remember what Nandini talked about, those timber plantations like eucalyptus and pine, all of those are also in the same landscape. So there's a lot of landscape change that's happened here. And if you remember, I'm not going to show you too much more data from genetics, but just to kind of summarize this, there's about 4.5–5 million year divergence between these hills and these at the Pangaea Gap, and about 1.5 million years here, okay? And maybe about 10 to 20,000 or so between these mountains here. And what we wanted to do was, and this we assume it's about 100–150 years because that is when deforestation happened. This is inside that island. So here what we wanted to do was, until now I was talking to you about genetic differences. So we wanted to add another data from another kind of marker, which is cultural differences. And why that matters is that as you know, any cultural trait can be transmitted. It doesn't have to go through generations. It can be transmitted by learning. right? So it's not like gene flow or anything like that. So you can have, let's say, individuals speaking Tamil on one side of the Western Ghats. If they move to the other side, they will, end up learning Malayalam or something like that, right? So, so you can have. The idea is that can we use bird song to understand the differences between these populations? And this is not new. Globally, like internationally, people have shown this in several populations. Only thing is that here we had a scenario where we know a lot about the populations based on the genetic data that we collected. Now the question was, can we recover similar patterns based on just the song data, right? So that's what we set out to do. And now we are slowly coming to this, the first question that that I asked you, do those birds sound the same? And the way we do that is that we go out and we record these birds and we kind of convert those songs into spectrograms, which is, you have time here and you have frequency here, and then you make a lot of measurements based on that. So you have note length, song length, high frequency, low frequency, and this is measured at the note level, and then it's kind of summarized at the song level. And our analysis then happens at the song level. So, so there are a number of variables that we consider when we are kind of doing these statistical comparisons. So I also want to tell you about one interesting variable, and this is not from the short wing. This is a wood thrush, and this is an animation from the Cornell labs. So the background is that birds have two syringes. So essentially they can, in theory, make two sounds at the same time. Okay, it's a little bit difficult to imagine. So what I'll do is I'll play this for you, and then you can see the sound coming and this, the two sides, hopefully. Sorry, that did not work. Let's see. Oh yeah. Yeah, was that, did you catch that? So basically it's making two frequencies, right? So there's this high frequency notes that are being made by one side of the, yeah? I mean, you're talking about this animation, right? But actually, this is at the time scale is here. So it's literally at the same time. I mean, that is just an animation just to kind of show, it doesn't mean anything. This is the real thing. So the sound that is produced is, and this is one time. Yeah? So it's actually producing two sounds at the same time. There are a lot of ideas about why this may be. So they say that, so song is actually used as it's a signal for sexual selection. So more complex songs, females select individuals that have more complex songs. And one way to increase song complexity is by actually having a lot of frequency kind of shifts. And one way to create very strikingly different frequencies is to have, one syrinx go high frequency and the other doing low frequency, right? This is an idea that people propose. But in any case, that seems to be, so unfortunately, we can't do that with, the syrinx stuff with the short wing in the Western Ghats. But what we did notice was, so technically, you don't know that it is two syrinx making the sound unless you actually you demonstrate that. So technically, these are called complex vocal mechanisms. So you could have two sounds being produced, not just because of sirens, but because of some other things that happen also. But for simplicity's sake, we could just call it two siren, dual sirens, or the CVM. Okay. So what we noticed was that there were some individuals that seemed to be making two sounds at the same time, but some of them did not have that kind of those sounds coming at the same time. So we quantified this. So we estimated how frequently this happens. Then we also looked at syntax, which is very simply how unique, how many unique songs are there out of a total song bout. So for example, in this, so this is a song, this is another, there are 5 songs here, and these 3 are unique, while these 2 are the same. This is slightly modified from this, and this seems to be new, and this is a repetition of this, right? So there are 3 unique songs out of a total 5. So we created some kind of a song variety index. So this is syntax, what we are calling syntax, okay? So now that we had all of this, we then did some statistical analysis to understand how these populations are different. And our data has a nested structure. So there were several notes in a song, several songs at the level we did the analysis, and we had many individuals for which we had collected songs, and several individuals of every region. So, and we were trying to compare different regions, okay? So that is basically our study design. And very simply, what we found was that all of these mountaintops seem to have very different songs, okay? And this is not very surprising because that is expected, because if you have populations that are isolated for very long periods of time, they would have different songs. But what was interesting was that this CVM or dual sirens usage seemed to be different across most of the populations, even the deforested landscape. So forests that were separated by just 100 years of deforestation seem to show differences. Now this is, again, there are studies that have shown that changes in frequency happens rather quickly, and the response of birds, the bird songs to anthropogenic noise like traffic noise and all that, there are these frequency shifts that happen. So that adaptation can happen fairly quickly, and something similar may be happening here. But what we found was syntax. Remember the Palghat gap and the Shenkota gap. So the syntax differences were mostly only across these biogeographic divides, these old divergences. Okay, so so in some sense, we are able to not only use songs to understand how populations are isolated from each other, but different parts of the song, data of the song, can inform us about old relationships and some very recent divergences. So this we thought was very cool, and largely because of the system that we have, the Western Ghats system, where you have this, different kinds of isolations happening at the same time. So, if all of this is confusing you, basically there are still only 3 biologically significant groups. You can test them by playing the songs back to each other and so on, and you can see where they respond more. Very similar to what Nandini was, talking to you about with the squirrels. So now what we are trying to do is, take this analysis a little bit forward by trying to find out if there are any unique signatures of song in some populations. To give you an example from human language, you can think of the alphabet, right? Ra. Yeah. So that is fairly unique, and it occurs only in some languages. So if you encounter this alphabet somewhere, you can kind of place it in some geographic area. The question is, can we do something similar for the birds? Like if you hear the song, you just hear the song of a bird, someone recorded on the internet or something like that, you listen to it. I mean, can you then place that individual in a particular population? This is fairly easy to say, but it's actually very difficult to do. And we've been kind of trying to figure this for a while. So what we now have is we have a field station in Kodaikanal where we have a lot of these banded birds. So we have these ringed birds. So we know the individuals. And we go out there and record the songs of these birds and annotate them and so on. So these are the people who've been working on this. And this is a BSMS. We have a BSMS program, Integrated Bachelor's Master's program. And he just started birding, and he got very curious with this short-wing song. And he comes from a very physics and maths background. So he wanted to say, so he said, let me try using some other techniques and see if we can get some biological meaning, from that. And what he's been doing, so this is just an ongoing kind of story. He's been trying to understand the complexity of song in this bird, which is now called the Sholakili. So the idea is very simple. So some of these songs can be really long, and you can see that this is some notes are kind of similar, some are variations of each other, right? But you can see that if you were to classify this, you could say that's A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, and then this is the other sequence, right? And what we want to understand is how much variation is there in different individuals. So you can see that some elements actually repeat as complete sets, while some others can just occur by itself. So, I'm not telling you more about this because it's still work in progress, but these students are trying to develop, Suyash especially, he's trying to develop some kind of mathematical kind of a formula to signify complexity, and he's trying to measure this in different ways. Apart from the regular, and he's comparing it with the Shannon kind of diversity and those indices, but he's trying to develop something of his own as well. So I think what I wanted to say here is that a lot of research in ecology and evolution is it can have interdisciplinary. What do you say? It reaches out to different fields. So there's a lot of physics. So there are people who are interested in physics who get interested in ecology. Especially, you can imagine that bioacoustics is very rich with that. There can be mathematics and modeling kind of work that happens a lot in ecology. A lot of theoretical ecology is very similar to theoretical physics and things like that. Chemistry, there's a whole field of chemical ecology now that is developing, which is related to chemicals and how organisms are kind of communicating with each other based on these chemicals. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah.
So have anybody used what you use in classical linguistics in these patterns, like the Chomsky syntax?
So yeah, so I have these two collaborators. So I don't do this myself. I have a collaborator in IIT Madras and one in IIT Mandi. They're from the same. I don't know if you know Dr. Hema, who works with a lot of these algorithms. Yeah, Hema Murthy. Yeah. So it's from their group, and they've been kind of hitting it with various approaches. And I'm not sure we are at a biologically meaningful point now, which is why I've kind of just left that open. So in terms of just statistics, there are several that are there. The question is, some work for some species, but for some other species like the sholikili, actually it has a very complex song, and it has a lot of immediate change. So I think it's a little bit more complicated. It may need a little bit more work, but yeah.
I think this question is interesting.
Huh.
There are four categories of grammar that Chomsky proposed, and they can basically fit almost any sequence.
Yeah. Anything which is presumably a language.
Yeah.
Will have a basic framework.
Yeah, but I see that point. The problem is, how do you get to this?
You need a corpus of these.
Yeah, but you also need a biologically meaningful way of describing these different notes.
That's true, but I mean the point that if you say that there is a pattern which
Yeah.
is like a language,
Yeah,
would probably then help
Yeah.
you in. I mean, knowing that probably helps you in deciphering a lot, which otherwise. I mean, so like you have marked this in green. I mean,
Yeah.
you obviously see a pattern here, right?
yeah.
There's something which is repeating, and
Yeah.
that can be something like a war.
Okay.
So you might be putting things together in a song which is meaningful to somebody else.
Yeah. Okay, so I should probably look that up a little bit more and see how we can build on that.
Yeah, so
But-
there are these very generalized frameworks by which you can try and find out whether there is something which is underlying.
Yeah.
To
Yeah, but actually, I understand that. The problem that we face is getting to that point where you say that something is H or R or S, because you see a lot of variation between these notes, and you don't know at what point, where do you draw these cutoffs between these different notes.
yeah, so there will be these variations, and there will be a lot of noise.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Noise means
Yeah.
white noise from the signal.
But once you get past
once you
that,
start
then I
getting
think,
a little
yeah.
bit of pattern, once you get a lot of data, I think it's relatively. I don't know. I mean, how much data you have.
Yeah.
Because some of these exercises really require huge amount of data.
I see.
Decipher the pattern.
Yeah.
In biology, when we say meaning, it is very specific to the receiver. So if there's an intended receiver, say for instance, the bird is singing to attract the female, so this song is only relevant to that female. And it is possible that the song already has a certain function which is to attract the male. Now, whether there is some other kinds of meaning, for instance, if you have this set of notes being repeated, it is likely to reflect a certain trait of that individual. That is a very it's really non-trivial task. It is
No, I understand that.
something
Yeah.
where each individual will have to be mapped in this fitness
Yeah.
philosophy, that what is the fitness of this individual and how do you measure fitness itself is something which we debate endlessly.
No, sure. I
So
mean,
in that sense, assigning meaning one has to be,
Yeah.
being conservative is.
So I mean, these school of linguists, they think that language is instant. It's kind of a hardware by which you can learn language, understand language, decipher a series of sequences to figure out what is a word and what is not a word, etc. So where to put the breakpoints, etc.
Chomsky philosophy, syntax is different from semantics, so you don't have to worry about meaning.
Yeah.
I
You
see.
can just analyze, if you have a corpus, you can see, can you create a generative grammar that can generate things in your corpus and maybe songs that you haven't seen before. And you can perhaps, so you can identify different things as tokens without actually remember the meaning.
I see.
So he has this famous sentence, colorless green ideas run furiously, which is a syntactically correct and
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's definitely worth kind of looking at and see how this works. I mean, actually, a lot of my discussions with the engineering, the people who work on even just detection of different sound and automated classification and things like that, those algorithms. Um, so they think that this is not a very difficult task because they work with human speech with multiple speakers, and they are able to pick different speakers and actually automated. There are very nice algorithms that give you a very clean output. But somehow some of those approaches don't seem to work when it comes to yeah. And also bird song, even field part is just that's definitely there, like the noise and so on. Yeah. Anyway, so just to very quickly, in terms of the song, I think that I really like the idea of using bird song because it seems to provide a lot of information, both old and recent, as I was saying. And you can easily kind of scale this to larger landscapes fairly easily without very intensive efforts like with blood sample collection and so on. So there's a whole bunch of people that I could thank, but a lot of the photographs were taken by this person, Prasenjit Yadav, and including this National Geographic award-winning photo from Nilgiris, actually. All right, so thank you, and any other questions? Yeah.
Do the birdsong and notes and things vary across altitude by any chance?
So at least the way we did the study, the problem is that birdsong can change with context very easily. So it can change with the kind of habitat. And also what that means is that if you have a dense habitat, you see certain kinds of frequencies, and then as opposed to sparse and open habitats. That is one. The other is the community. So you could have similar habitat, but there's some kind of acoustic space that is occupied by a bird community. So some species may sing and occupy a specific part of that space. But when the community is different, it may occupy a different space. Okay, so what we have done with these studies is that all our studies are conducted in the same habitat and in similar communities. So we are kind of hoping that the differences then are more related to just isolation rather than some adaptation there. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in the last slide, you showed the variations in the songs of two individuals or Shola Kili, right?
Yeah.
So how much variation is in the song of a single individual at two different time points, or is there any?
Yeah. So one of the students is actually doing that. So I had recorded in Kodaikanal. I have recordings from I think 2007 or something like that. And she's comparing song complexity between then and like now 2018 when we got the last season's data. And there seem to be differences, but the problem is that what do these differences mean? I think, yeah, so when there is so much variation, anything seems to be different. There's variation within individual just between bouts. So the thing is that we have to look at variation, over and above individual variation, over and above between individual variation, and then compare that with between time. But surely, like there are other studies that have shown that, who have tracked individuals. So we did not track individuals. We hope to start doing that now. But in other studies in Martha's Vineyard, I think that's this famous study where they've looked at song changing over time, and they can see that some syllables are carried forward and some are lost. So you see actually extinction of different song types and so on.
Actually, why I asked this because of the discussion on the Chomskyan grammar, that if there is a lot of variation in the song of an individual itself, that may hint that there is some underlying generative grammar where they can form, let's say, sentences. Or if you do not find any variation at all, that means the song is just hardwired into things. I mean, that is just in speculation.
No, it's just.
Seems like there is a lot of variation.
There is variation,
There is
but
a lot of variation even within an individual.
yeah. So whenever we are quantifying, we are like very mindful of the variation that's there. So everything is, the comparison is always nested. So we have multiple songs of the same individual, then multiple individuals, and then we do comparisons between that nested set.
So is this song learned? Is there do we know that? Because all of this is only true if there is song learning involved.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, and this whole idea of
when they nest, when the fledglings come out, is
the males are
both
singing.
sexes produce the sound, or it's only the male?
So the sexes are monomorphic, and till now we have our favorite.
Say no more.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah. So we think it is males that are singing because behaviorally you can see that there are some differences. So when the young are out, the males are, I mean, what we think are males, seem to be singing. So definitely there is some learning, and some kind of social learning thing also must be there, because you can see that as you go, that dual syrinx usage, that changes as you go from one place to the other. So with distance, that frequency of dual syrinx usage changes. So, yeah.
So all shortlies use dual syrinx.
So some individuals use them lots, and it seems to be like a population kind of a trait. So if you go to Kodaikanal, many of the individuals seem to use this dual syrinx. But you travel like 40 kilometers just in the same elevation, same kind of habitat, go towards Munnar, and you don't see it.
How is it identified that they're using two?
Sorry?
How is it identified that they're using two?
Oh, that is just by looking at the spectrogram, and you can see the overlap between the nodes. So just that. So we don't know if it's dual syrinx, but definitely it's producing two sounds at the same time.
Actually, the call sounds like, the one you played first.
Yeah.
It's like as if it's gathering its breath as it's singing.
Yeah.
Whereas the next one is like, releasing its breath as it's singing.
Yeah. So actually, a lot of the song, the classification also happens. They have something called the mini breath, where they breathe, and those breaks that somebody mentioned, that there are more breaks in some song. So that apparently comes from that, and that's some hardwired thing that happens in several birds apparently.
Thank you.
All birds have this dual syrinx?
No, for sure, but in several birds, I think there are times when you have this, but it's mostly in passerine birds that they find things like this. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.